Now, technology is clearly driving progress in almost every area of our lives, but a connected world also brings with it significant risk, making supply chains now a regular target for cyber criminals. NEISA, the European Union Agency for Cyber Security, has predicted a fourfold increase in supply chain software attacks in 2021 and has warned businesses that however resilient their own cybersecurity may be, they're only as strong as their weakest link. Evidence shows more and more incidents of suppliers being targeted to infiltrate and disrupt bigger businesses for criminal purposes. The agency's Threat Landscape for Supply Chain Attacks study, published this summer, warned that organizations need to update their cybersecurity methodology with supply chain attacks in mind, and to incorporate all their suppliers in their protection and security verification. They stated, as the cost of direct attacks against well-protected organizations increase, cybercriminals prefer to attack their supply chain, which provides the additional motivation of a potentially large-scale and cross-border impact. But in such a richly connected world, how can you build resilience against digital attacks on logistics operations? Well, I'm pleased to say we're joined by Erik Heskes of cybersecurity consultancy Lemonshark and Alwin Peppels of Cyber Seals to discuss cyber intrusions into transport companies and take a look at strategies to prevent them. Erik will join us here in the studio shortly with his presentation, but first we'll join Alwin for his presentation virtually.
Great, all right, let's just kick it off. All right, this talk was going to be one talk originally. It was called A Richly Connected World, Resilience Against Digital Attacks on Logistics. Unfortunately, due to illness, I have to give it remotely. So what we decided to do was split up the talk in two parts, of which I'll give the first one, and then Erik Heskes will continue with the second one, which is a bit more in-depth on ransomware. But this first one will be a digital resilience primer, basically. Who am I? I'm Alwin Peppels. I'm a security researcher and consultant. I've been doing that professionally for about 5 years now. And yeah, I'll hope to share a bit on at least the threats which logistics face today and some of the philosophy which you might use to make your organization more resilient to that. So we'll go over a brief list of what we see in our practice, at least most today, the threats which actually impact logistics, some of the common themes on what's going wrong there, what's being attacked, and then the rest of the talk will mainly go over some organizational resilience strategies, which are both against external attacks, but are also around just internal errors and making sure that availability stays high. There's a quick disambiguation that I want to make just to avoid confusion. In digital security, there's a term supply chain attack, which is sort of separate from logistics. It's a sort of two-stage attack where someone wants to compromise companies or users, usually of a piece of software. So what they do is they attack the supplier or the producer of the software so they can infect the product. And throughout this talk and the next one, we'll try to stick to digital attacks on logistics if we actually mean just cyber criminals attacking the supply chain as you know it in a traditional sense. And in the next talk, you'll also see a case of a ransomware, REvil Kaseya, which is actually a combination of both. So it's an actual supply chain attack where the digital product was infected and the trusted source was sort of compromised with the supplier, which was then used to infect logistics with ransomware. So that's a supply chain attack on the supply chain. And the things we see a lot these days, I guess one of the main culprits is ransomware. There is just a very painful combination of logistics being very dependent on availability and being running 24/7, which makes it a likely target for ransomware. Organizations have a lot of moving parts, so there's a lot of attack surface. But corporate espionage is also a danger, which we see and have to mitigate, because there's a lot of information on who your customers are, where your stuff is, which would make for some good business intelligence. And then on the more organized crime side, what you're seeing is organizations trying to read data, so finding out where valuable stuff is so it can be intercepted, but also sometimes changing data, so actually rerouting containers, rerouting packages to different locations, to different delivery times, to get them in a position where they might be taken easier. And then there's some other things which are specific to logistics, which do more of an abuse of trust relationships. So what you can see is organizations trying to duplicate brands, which are well known or at least somewhat familiar, and then they might try to run away with the goods, but usually it's about scamming people out of forwarding fees, things like that. And also just the whole transactions which happens in logistics are vulnerable to some specific attacks, like organizations not releasing the bill of lading unless a ransom is paid. So it can't be accepted as having arrived there. So the common denominators there are technical vulnerabilities being abused and leveraged, which happens across a lot of businesses. Trust relationships being abused with people or brands, and this is also common in a lot of other businesses. There's things like CEO fraud, where an attacker will try to falsify an email by some CEO level executive, usually, in order to get finance to execute a transaction for a large amount to an attacker-controlled bank account, basically. But because there's so many moving parts, there's a lot of danger as well in attackers actually messing with business processes and leveraging flaws in business logic. And as I said, availability is usually paramount. So in logistics, it's at least common to put that, to do a lot of things in a short amount of time. It's an industry of optimization, basically, where a lot of effort goes into making things more lean while still being safe. But that, of course, might also heighten the risk of an attack. So some notable cases would be the Port of Antwerp, which suffered a prolonged digital attack, which was also facilitated by hardware, which was placed there by the cyber criminals. So what they did was they included computer hardware, basically, in power outlet boxes, in extension cords, and other small hardware, like a NAS, network storage device, which they put there and used to compromise the company and actually reroute containers which contain drugs, so they could be intercepted more easily. Which is an example of business logic and business processes being attacked, vulnerabilities in that being leveraged, and people actually writing data and changing delivery times to make the stealing and smuggling more easy. And of course, the well-known example with FedEx and Maersk, both being impacted by NotPetya or Netya, which acted like a ransomware, but was probably just designed to destroy data. And there's some theories that it was actually more of a target on the Ukrainian economy, and the other companies were targeted in other operations. So yeah, it might have been motivated by state-sponsored actors. That's at least likely in the case of NotPetya. And then to look at some case studies which are not really due to attacks, but which show that accidents happen all the time, and you don't even need bad intentions to cause them. There was an outage at Amazon AWS. It was around 4 years ago, and they made a great write-up on their website where they explained that someone with admin access actually entered a command wrong. So yeah, they basically made a typo. This caused a cascading failure. It took down more machines than it needed. One of those machines actually kept track of all the assets which were running S3, which is their hosting provider and which is a backbone of a large part of the internet, actually. Then Elastic Cloud 2, which is the storage, the scalable storage, which a lot of companies also use, depended on that. And it got taken down because it was a dependency. But then there was also a health dashboard, which showed the uptime status of all the services. It actually showed green. It failed to show any errors because it was actually built on S3. So that's something where you see there's the snake biting its own tail. It's a bit circular. You don't want those things to depend on each other. They made sure there was no personal blame. They looked at the organization. They determined one person should not be able to cause this much impact, this much detrimental impact. So they didn't blame the person for making a typo. That just happens, and their stance was actually that the organization should be able to handle it. Facebook had a very similar situation just a few weeks ago, I guess. Someone made some changes to the settings which actually manage the facebook.com domain. And they took that offline. And that also made sure that people couldn't use the admin interfaces anymore because those were hosted via the Facebook domain. So that's, again, a chicken and egg situation, which caused a horrible amount of downtime. The physical access systems, like the card readers to the buildings, actually relied on that domain being up. So they failed as well. And then the people who actually knew how to fix the configuration had to find the people who had physical access to the servers to actually bring everything back up. So that prolonged the downtime. But what they did very well was they practiced coming back up online. They made the point that turning everything back on causes a huge surge in traffic. It causes a huge surge in electricity usage, and that might take everything down. So what they do is actually do that on purpose, just in normal operations, to make sure that the systems can handle it and that it has the properties that they want. And that's sort of the lesson that I want to convey, mainly in this talk. If you look at Google, they don't really try to prevent hard drives from failing. They know that they will fail and they make sure they can handle it. At Netflix, as I'll discuss in a few minutes, they don't really try to prevent servers from failing. They know that happens. They make sure that everything can handle it, and they actually do it on purpose in production. So the best way to become resilient is actually assume that accidents will happen. Malware will run on workstations, people will make typos, and actually, yeah, even cosmic rays will hit your chips and cause errors there. So it's best to have defense in depth, be prepared, and make sure everything has a backstop. The philosophy that's sort of come out of this is chaos engineering. And it really is about knowing yourself and creating awareness. So what, like I said, what Netflix does is they really don't try to prevent servers from failing and falling over. They actually have a they actually cause failures in production by themselves. So they have a program called Chaos Monkey. It turns off virtual machines, which are actually running in production at random, which seems like a very counterproductive thing to do until you read the philosophy behind it. And it makes sure that engineers stay exposed to frequent failures, which actually forces them to become more resilient, become more aware, and to know their weaknesses. So it's an end-to-end test, basically, of your assumptions on the system, which can be daunting. So it has to be done in a controlled manner, but at least you can do it in a controlled manner when you still have some control. So the basic way to do this is basically a scientific approach. It's just making an hypothesis of the system can handle a certain type of disaster, a certain type of fault, and then testing that with experiment. So it's picking a steady state for some machines and then hypothesizing that it should be able to handle something. You have to measure it, make sure that it stays online, that it's having normal operation, use a control group and an experimental group, and then just, confront the experimental group with failures. So there should be some room for faults to occur, but of course you have to be very careful doing this in production to minimize user impact. I mean, if there's a few seconds of downtime while something switches over, then that is usually not an issue. But at least this allows you to cause the faults in a way that you can minimize the blast radius, basically. So when you do this, hopefully you'll hear people saying that they've discovered new ways that things interact, something causing a problem in another component which was unexpected, but also approaches which they thought they would would work but doesn't. So there can be a lot of things. The engineers can expect that gathering some type of data might be able to solve the problem, or at least give an indication of where to look. It might not do that. People might assume that turning something back on, everything would start right back up, which it doesn't. And if you're really lucky, you'll actually hear someone say, "Oh man, if I only fix this check in the code, then the impact could have been limited in the downstream components." Because what you really want is to make sure that everything stays modular. All the components have their own job, and they are not really dependent on many things beyond them if it's not needed. You want something to fail, and then the component to say, "Ah, well, that sucks, but I'm doing my own thing, and I'm going to stay online." And that's basically where it's at. Just like in investing, diversity and risk management is really key. Yeah, it's important not to put your eggs in one basket, and have more than one egg to break in the first place. And that's yeah. So what I mean with that is you can have redundant servers, but if you deploy broken code to both of them, it's still not going to help a lot. Spreading everything around geographically and technologically and organizationally is the best way to make it robust. Make sure that one person can bring the place down and actually introduce failures in a controlled manner to keep people aware. And that's my part.
Wonderful, Alwin. Thank you so much for your presentation. And in a moment, we'll be hearing from Erik for the second part of this presentation in this session. But before that, maybe I could ask you a few questions. First of all, what would you say are the most common mistakes that you see businesses making in terms of cybersecurity?
Well, that comes back to putting the eggs in one basket. So that can mean a lot of things. You can deploy the same code to a lot of servers while it's only being reviewed by one person. But it can also mean having all of your backups exposed to the same account. So one account can write over all of the backups that you have. That's a really bad thing. You want to segment things as much as possible. But then you have to go against the tendency of organizations to make things easy for themselves and make things easily accessible for themselves. So you have to provide counter pressure.
So you've maybe covered some of that already, but if you were running a big business responsible for shipping high value goods all over the world, what would be the most obvious checks that you would want to be carrying out on your suppliers?
So the things you can just quickly do, what I would personally do, is have a look at the organization, go through LinkedIn, maybe look at the middle management, because they're often representative of the company culture and the ethics. You could do a lot more deep diving there. Making sure you inquire about the track record, calling around. Human intelligence is still irreplaceable in something like this, so making sure that people have good experiences with them.
And what about employees? How big a risk would you say are the personal online accounts of employees to the cyber security of their employers?
Yeah, well, it can be a huge risk, and it's very hard to gauge if it is, basically, because there's no real transparency in credential reuse. So someone might use the same password for their personal account as for their work account, and that might leak and be very easy to tie to each other. So there's something called credential stuffing, which happens a lot. If a password is leaked, you can assume it's going to be tried on different websites to check if you've reused it and compromise those accounts as well. And yeah, you shouldn't check if people use the same password for their personal things and their business. You can't check if everything's going well and it's secured well, but that might be a problem if people do that.
We've just got a few questions coming in from the audience, Alwin. I think we've probably got time to squeeze one in. We're being asked, in relation to the case studies, are human error and system vulnerability incidents considered as cyber incidents, even if no malicious harm was actually intended?
Yeah, I guess that was just to illustrate the point that malicious intent is not necessary. Even then, large companies can be brought down by typo. So yeah, I would say it's definitely an incident, just of a milder category when it comes to the inciting factors, basically, but not when it comes to the impact.
Fantastic. Well, Alwin, thank you so much. I think we'll leave it there because we have the second presentation for this session with Erik to go to. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really sorry that you couldn't be with us today after all, but really fascinating presentation. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Welcome back, everyone, to the second half of this session. Erik, thank you so much for joining us and for coming to Tapper EMEA's virtual conference and to our studio. I'll hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and nice to be here.
Thank you.
All right. And thank you, Alwin, for making the preparations, and I hope you will recover soon. So, my name is Erik Heskes. I work for Lemonshark as a cybersecurity consultant. I've been involved in topics like red teaming, blue teaming, auditing, and security monitoring, more on the technical side of things. We're going to stick with the transport and logistics cyber threats, and then we're going to elaborate more on that number one threat, which is ransomware. Now, ransomware is very much a threat nowadays, and also threatening cyber transport and logistics. And we now have a brief look in order to refresh your memory a little bit, because ransomware has been there already for a while. Now I'm going to explain actually how it evolved and what it actually is, to refresh your memory a little bit. So if you have seen some recent examples in the news lately, you have seen for instance, in April 2021, there was the Colonial Pipeline. And to give an idea about the impact, the gas supply of Washington was affected. So people were basically out of gas. Planes were kept on the ground. And there was an attack on Cassia, and this is actually an example of a supply chain attack, where managed service provider is being infected with ransomware. In that way, the party it's managing is also gets infected because they were connected. Now, that was done by a ReEvil ransomware group, and for some reason, the decryption key was disclosed. This is still a bit of a rumor, but in any way, that attack then can be made undone because of that decryption key. Now, also, it's not only impacting financials. Well, financial of course very important, but the attack goes even further by attacking also hospitals. And there were a couple of attacks on the Irish public health system by Conti and on the American hospitals with Ryuk. And both they have in common that their business was halted to 80% or something, and the remaining 20% they needed to be able to continue, and they did their administration on paper in order to at least to be able to do something. Now, you could imagine when hospitals are being attacked, human lives could be at stake. This is also a positive note on to the ransomware gangs, because when they were aware of this, they eventually mentioned, okay, so this is a bridge too far for us. If that's really the deal, then please contact us and we send you the decryption key. So, another example on the Software AG company in Germany, these were also attacked by a ransomware group called Klop. Well, Klop in Dutch, it means a knock on wood, but Klop is actually a Russian word, and it means bed bugs. So, not very positive about that one. Well, actually, the impact was huge. Business was almost completely knocked off. And what they first did in AG Germany is they immediately refused to pay. And then what they did afterwards, Klop had their hands on their sensitive information about their customers, which they threatened to publish online. So that is really an extra, well, I would say, measure in order to make sure they were guaranteed and paid, but it's still not known if they eventually paid. So now, let's have a look at ransomware, what it actually is, and what the biggest and the most important elements are. Well, ransomware you can compare to something being kept hostage, and because of the encryption will do the hostage situation, and only being released after payment is being done, and mostly that's being done in cryptocurrency, or most popular one in Bitcoin. Now, what the encryption actually does, for instance, you have a plain text that's being encrypted with a symmetrical key. Then that plain text will be, well, unreadable. It's called ciphertext, and you need that same key in order to decrypt it again. Now, the advantage of symmetrical encryption is that it's very fast, but the disadvantage is that it can be broken. Now, there is also asymmetrical encryption, and then you will encrypt the plain text with your asymmetric key, and then you need a private key in order to decrypt it. Well, the private key is something you don't disclose it, you keep it to yourself, and the public key is publicly available, so you can consider a public key as a lock and a private key as a real key. Now, what the attacker will do, he will first encrypt all the files on disk by using symmetric encryption, and next he will encrypt that symmetric key with asymmetric encryption. So it's making use of hybrid encryption to have at least both advantage of both types of encryption. The second example, these are all the attack stages, and if you have a look, this looks a bit like a cyber kill chain, and it has also some similarities as well. And if you start looking at the first stage, first the delivery will be done, and that can be done via a phishing email or a drive-by download. And back in the 80s, they've done it making use of a floppy disk. Next, the malware will infect the system, and it will then try to set up a connection with a command and control server, where the rest of the software is being kept to carry on the rest of the attack of the ransomware. Now, the software remains on the command and control service being downloaded, and there is also the encryption software having the public key, and in the meanwhile the private key will stay on that command and control server. Now the encryption is starting, and after the files are encrypted, the ransomware software will leave a note behind. It could be a readme.txt file with instructions to pay, and that's really the extortion note. Now, this is typically an example of a type 1 attack, so we're only talking about one system being affected. Now, what happens in the meanwhile, or what could happen at the same time, is that after the encryption, the malware will try to infect other systems on the network, and this is called lateral movement. And also, the malware is trying to look for any sensitive information in order to exfiltrate that to use for further extortion. And last but not least, the malware will try to look for any backups of the system in order to make them unusable by encrypting these or destroy these. And this is called a type 2 attack. Now, if we move to the second slide, basically, if you have all these elements, sorry about that. You have all these elements like the malware, the exfiltration, the extortion, the ways in order to infect the system and set up the control to the command and control server. Well, when you have all these ingredients, you put it in a back bowl, you stir it, and then you have something that is called RAS, Ransomware as a Service. And Ransomware as a Service is a combination of all those things in order to generate as much as money as possible. So, for instance, they include also a chat and a help desk function with 24/7 availability in order to help people when they're maybe having problems downloading a decryption key or with any kind of payment. So RAS is really next level ransomware with all the things included. Now, you could imagine the money that they made in the beginning was because if you look at the payments they got in Bitcoins, could be that the first malware delivered them maybe a couple of Bitcoins gaining from that attack. And now we all know what happened in the course in the meanwhile, that exploded. So all these ransomware can become huge and enormous rich and amount of money, and they included that in their RAS service to be able to even purchase zero vulnerabilities and such. So you can imagine of all the ways they are having and all the possibilities they have now nowadays. Okay, let's have a look at the ransomware history. Back in the 80s, was I think around 1989. The first ransomware ever was being done by distributing floppy disks to people who were attending an AIDS conference. Afterwards, the actor social engineered all the addresses and was able to send them a floppy drive and to basically to install the software. And after the installation, the system got encrypted, or you had the choice or to pay an amount of money to use that software. Well, he used that way in order to try to extort people in order to get his payment for his software. Now, if you look at the elements, this is still basically some elements you will still see also in next level ransomware species. Now, the next thing that happened, because the first edition of floppy drives done by John Pop was using semantic encryption, and the next level was using asymmetric encryption as well. That was first being done in GP code, and next there was a CryptoLocker, and CryptoLocker was using also at first ransomware ever using a way of payment in Bitcoin. Now, then it became a little bit silent after a while, and there was also the non-encrypting software variants, like doing all kinds of other extortion and social engineering. For instance, the screen lockers. For instance, a fake browser message popped up, and with the message you have done something illegal and you needed to report into the authorities immediately. Well, basically, this was a type of social engineering, and that message just could be clicked away. But there also followed other types of extortion, including ransomware with police kind of statement that will, like, for instance, Revton. And then it became a little bit silent more afterwards. And then other types of ransomware started to appear, being more advanced and also doing things like lateral movement and try also to encrypt the backups, and exfiltration. I mentioned before the type 2 attacks. And that started with Petya, NotPetya, Locky, WannaCry, and these kind of other species. Now, and what we have nowadays is DarkSide, ReEvil, Riot, Clop, GrandCrab. These are nowadays the most common species of ransomware, having all these elements from RAS in them. Okay, if you have to take a look at these statistics, these are taken from VirusTotal. You can look up these yourself, and you will see that GrandCrab actually was having the most infections in the time, which also surprises me a little bit, because GrandCrab made an official statement they have retired, so don't know exactly, could be a copycat as well, not entirely sure. And you see some other species I mentioned before, which are still being active today. Now, it's time for some demonstration, and what this demo is going to show, that is in a digital world where everything is connected, and even in supply and logistics, you're depending on the weakest link in the chain, and that could be a third party you're doing business with, you're having a VPN with, or any other kind of connection. And I just want to show you how easy it is to infect the system in order to encrypt it. Now first, the victim will receive a PDF file and is trying to open it. And immediately the attacker gets a reverse shell in return, where he is having full control over the system already. Now he will try to see what operating system he's dealing with and what directory could be there with enough permissions in order to upload his malware over there. And in this example, it's a WannaCry ransomware. So he's now uploading the malware. And after the malware has been uploaded, you might want to try to execute that. So he's switching over to the Windows shell here and confirms the malware is already there. And then executing the file. And what happens next? The whole system is encrypted. Now, if this is a third party you're doing business with, this might be not some very good not some very good news. And it could be now the alarm bell should start going off in order to investigate, in order how to look into further steps in order to protect your business. So what we do next, we're going to have a look to the alerts in our SIEM system if there is any kind of malicious activity. And we have noticed there is some malicious traffic being observed here. Can I pause this for a little bit? You will notice here an IP address which is considered malicious. Now, if we know there is a malicious IP address and there is some malicious traffic trying to reach that IP address, we can take that IP address, please continue, and put that into our SIEM search in order to investigate if there's which source IP address is trying to establish a connection to that malicious IP address in the Tor network. So we now quickly copy that IP address over. And it's shown there in the console. And now we notice there is also a source IP address exposed over there. We are able now to investigate now. And this is important because the infection hasn't started yet. We still have a way to prevent it by containing that source IP address, take it offline, or make sure in order to contact the owner in order to take any measures in order to stop the infection from spreading. Now, the next example shows an advanced search, which is looking for any kind of ransomware activity on the system, and that could be a ransomware node left behind by the software or special file description or extension referred to any ransomware attack. Well, in this example here you will see there is actually a README file left behind, and that could be a ransomware node, and there is also a decryptor.exe found, which means there is a WannaCry infection going on. Well, this is also important because the infection already started on the system, but we know we have now sufficient information in order to maybe contain that situation to stop the infection from spreading to other systems in the network, could be to other customers or other business partners or anything. We still have a way to control the situation. Now, if you've seen all this, well, we need a good preparation in order to deal with these kind of cyber threats. Well, the best way, and I think it's best to start first looking at, okay, how valid are our backups, how good are they, and if these are offline, are these being tested well enough in order to recover from such scenario? And if these are online, then make sure these are right protected. And if you're using, for instance, a cloud service to back up your systems, make sure then the data is immutable. So that means that the data is not able to change for a certain period of time. Now, the most popular way to start actually these infections is being done by macros. The macro in a document will eventually trigger something. The user needs to enable that, and the infection will start happening. And well, of course, sometimes macro is maybe necessary in order to do something, but I would prefer and advise to basically not use macros at all and disable them, and only in certain situations where it's absolutely necessary to allow it. Next, in terms of prevention, and mostly the ransomware infections the delivery is mostly being done by a phishing email. And when you're able to detect that already at your front door, having good email protection to be able to see if the attachment on that email is maybe infected with a virus, you are still able to maybe to quarantine it or at least get rid of that attachment before someone clicks on it and it will affect the rest of the systems. Now, in terms of detection, I've shown you before the IP address we looked up in a SIEM system, that is Security Information and Event Monitoring, which is a system which basically it aggregates all the logs of all of your systems and your networks, your firewalls, your load balancers, etc. All that information goes basically into one bucket, be able to search on it. You can do even threat hunting on it, and you can, for instance, set some alerts when a special kind of malicious behavior occurs, then you are notified. To focus on the endpoints, you can protect these with antivirus software, obviously, but you can also put an extra addition on it, which is EDR, Endpoint Detection and Response System. Well, what that does is it will look what changes on the operating system, like the processes, is there something in the registry, is there something off in general, like an anomaly, and it using also the information from the logs and even capable of including machine learning as well. So that would be a nice addition to have next to the antivirus to detect a ransomware attack in time. Next, what you can also is very important to make sure your systems are properly segmented, that if there is a ransomware infection going on, it's not easy to spread to other systems because the network is being segregated. And it does not only apply to the network, I would also say it would apply how you're dealing with your user accounts, for instance. Make sure segment these as well to separate the low privilege accounts from the high privilege accounts. Also very important to mention is how would you prepare against a ransomware attack if you don't know exactly what it does and how it looks like. I would say it's best to practice these, and for instance doing a red team exercise with a ransomware simulation attack, so you know what kind of characteristics a ransomware attack has, and you know how to deal with these things. And these are mostly being done also in terms of fire drills and in terms of recovery scenarios where everything is being rehearsed. It could also be a tabletop exercise, for instance, and then you just discussing the whole scenario on paper. Well, this could be a red team and blue team exercise, as I previously mentioned, and this term is derived from the military. That means that the red team will attack the blue team in order to expose the vulnerabilities in the blue team, so the blue team is able to take action to detect it and to repair it, basically. Now, this can be done by a phishing exercise, for instance. It could be a ransomware simulation. It could be a tabletop exercise. It could even be an awareness training to be able to make people familiar with all kind of attacks they can expect in their business. Now, we have taken all these measures and still it's not good enough. How is that possible? Well, there are always risks. For instance, that an infection is going on and you're not aware of it, and in the meantime you think, I'm well protected by taking care of good backup procedures, but then again, you haven't seen there was already infection going on, and it will be backed and it's sitting there in your backups, and then it will also eventually encrypt your backups as well, so that could be a disaster scenario there, so you need to be very aware of what's going on there. Obviously, I already mentioned ransomware is mostly delivered in a phishing email. Well, somebody always can make a mistake by, for instance, not seeing that it was phishing and click on the link and then then you're too late, and the infection is going to start. And basically, nowadays it is really hard to distinguish a good email from a bad email. So sometimes it's not worth blaming them. Also, if you look at disaster recovery procedures, so if there is an infection going on and a disaster scenario is going to happen, there are errors in communication, things should be documented, are not there, people are not able to find their way around, and that could cause some delays, which is, in the case of a ransomware infection, it could be disastrous. And therefore, we just need to take in account that these things will already happen. So a user will already has clicked maybe a link on a phishing email and the infection is already starting. Well, at least if we take these things in account, we already know, can prepare for the next steps to be able to maybe to prevent the next stage of the attack. Also, we'll just take into account malware will eventually run on our workstations. These are already infected. If we take this in account, we can already think about, okay, if that's happening, what should we then on our endpoint maybe in order to tighten the security or make sure these are better hardened, improve the detection measures on that area. The vulnerabilities will actually be exploited because the ransomware as a service, the RAS ecosystems have so much money and so many possibilities in order eventually they will able to purchase their own 0 days. So eventually these will be exploited. And if we take this as an account already, then we can already prepare in order to make sure we can have at least detect the unusual behavior in this area. Now, to close off, I would like to have a look at my key takeaways. I have mentioned backups before, and this will be important to have these offline and online. Obviously, make sure you are able to do and to roll out a patch anytime and be able to reverse it as well. Make sure you have a good incident response procedure in place so you know what to do in case an infection is really starting. You have everything documented. Obviously, repeat those exercises, do them randomly, red team exercises, ransomware simulation attacks, and learn from it to prepare for a next attack. And last but not least, my final word about it is to don't bet on just one strategy. Don't think EDR is going to solve all this whole problem, but combine all the different strategies to apply defense in depth. So, I think that's about it. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming in, Erik.